"We'll freeze if we don't stay close," the Apache woman warned. The rancher had no choice. The cold wind cut across the high plateau like a knife, carrying the first hints of snow from the distant mountains. John Carter, a rancher who had spent most of his life in the rugged hills of northern New Mexico, tightened the scarf around his neck and adjusted the brim of his hat. He had been traveling for hours, leading a small herd of cattle from one grazing field to another. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long, deep shadows across the snowy ground. John knew this part of the plateau well. He had ridden these trails since he was a boy, learning to read the land, to feel the wind and the snow, to sense the hidden dangers in the uneven terrain. Yet, despite his experience, a strange unease had been settling in his chest all morning, as if the landscape itself was warning him of something he could not yet see. The cattle moved slowly, their hooves crunching in the frozen grass and the early snow. Each breath they exhaled created little clouds that hung in the cold air before fading into the gray sky. John had done this drive countless times, but this time felt different. The clouds were heavier, darker, and the wind was picking up in a way that made him tighten his jacket around his thin frame. He had checked the weather before leaving, and it had promised only light snow, nothing more. Now the first real flakes began to fall, tiny at first, then steadily growing into a soft, steady curtain that covered the land. John slowed the herd, urging them forward, listening to the snow as it landed on his hat and shoulders, thinking about the miles he still had to cover before he could reach the safety of a lower valley. He paused for a moment to catch his breath and surveyed the plateau. It was beautiful in its starkness. The rolling hills stretched into the horizon, dotted with scrub trees and jagged rocks. Snow was already beginning to collect in the hollows, painting the world in shades of white and gray. But beauty here was always mixed with danger. John knew the land could be unforgiving if he underestimated it. He had heard stories from other ranchers, of cattle lost in snowdrifts, of men trapped on icy ridges, of storms that came on so suddenly that there was no time to react. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the cold alone, but from the feeling that this storm was one of those rare, serious ones. As he adjusted his saddle and prepared to continue, a figure appeared at the edge of the path. At first he thought it was a shadow or a trick of the fading light. Then he saw her clearly, a woman, elderly, with long dark hair streaked with silver, wrapped in blankets that had clearly seen many winters. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and calm, and she stood perfectly still, as if she had been waiting for him. John instinctively slowed the herd, instinct telling him that this was not someone to be ignored. The woman's presence on this remote plateau, in the middle of an unexpected storm, was surprising enough to make him pause. He had met travelers before, and occasionally a fellow rancher might cross paths with him, but this woman did not move like a traveler. She moved with purpose, with knowledge, with the quiet authority of someone who had walked this land for decades, perhaps all her life. "Good evening," John called out, raising his hand in greeting. He tried to keep his voice steady, though the wind carried it away almost as soon as it left his mouth. The woman stepped closer, her boots crunching softly in the snow. Her voice was calm, deep, and surprisingly strong. "You must stay close," she said. Her accent was soft but unmistakable, the kind that carried the echoes of her people's language. "We'll freeze if we don't stay close." John frowned slightly. Her words were simple, almost like a warning, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. He had always trusted his own experience, his own instincts, yet something about her presence made him reconsider. He could see the truth in her eyes, a quiet certainty that made him pause in his tracks. For a moment, John hesitated. Pride had always been part of him. He had survived harsh winters before, led herds across dangerous passes, and trusted only himself and his own knowledge of the land. Yet now, as the snow grew heavier and the wind more insistent, he felt something unfamiliar: doubt. Maybe, just maybe, this woman knew something he didn't. He looked at her, noting the calm determination in her stance. She didn't speak again, simply waited for his response, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she could read the weather and the land like a map written in the sky. Finally, John nodded. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll stay close." There was no other choice. The snow was coming down too fast, the wind growing stronger and the temperature dropping. If he did not listen, if he tried to go on his own, he could risk losing himself. Or worse, losing the herd he had worked so hard to care for. He urged his horses closer, signaling them to follow him as he moved toward the woman, keeping the herd together as best he could. The snowflakes danced around him, cold and relentless, and he felt the first real sting of fear. Not panic, not yet, but awareness. Awareness that nature had its own rules, rules that he could not break, rules that he had to respect. The woman led him across a narrow ridge, and John followed, each step measured and careful. He watched her, trying to understand the way she moved, the way she navigated the uneven terrain. It was as if she was part of the land itself. Her feet did not slip, her balance never faltered, and her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, noting every shadow, every drift, every obstacle that could threaten them. John realized he had underestimated the storm. The snow was beginning to cover the path, hiding holes and rocks that could trip a horse or injure a cow. Yet, under her guidance, he began to see safe passages he had missed before, led not by instinct alone but by years of lived experience. He started to follow her more closely, matching her pace, learning the rhythm of survival in a place where one wrong step could be fatal. As they moved, John thought about the years he had spent on this land. He had grown up learning to ride, to rope, to care for cattle, to read the sky for signs of weather. He had always been independent, proud of his ability to survive and adapt. But now, in the presence of this woman, he realized that independence had its limits. Survival was not just about skill or strength, it was also about humility, about listening to those who had knowledge he did not possess. He felt a strange gratitude, mixed with awe. Here, on a cold plateau in the middle of a snowstorm, he was learning a lesson he would not forget, a lesson written in the snow and the wind, taught by someone who had walked these paths for decades. The herd stayed close, sensing the urgency in John's voice and the calm authority in the woman's movements. Occasionally, a cow would stray slightly, but John and the woman were quick to guide it back. The sound of their footsteps in the snow, the soft calls to the herd, and the whistle of the wind created a rhythm that seemed almost magical. For the first time in hours, John felt a strange peace amid the fear. The plateau was dangerous, yes, but it was also beautiful. Snowflakes clung to the branches of scrub trees, glistening like tiny crystals. Rocks were dusted in white, and the distant mountains looked like giants covered in frost. It was a harsh landscape, unforgiving in its cold, yet alive with quiet, raw beauty. By the time they reached a small ridge that overlooked a sheltered canyon below, John realized how far they had come. The sun had almost completely set, leaving only a pale twilight. The snow had thickened, and the wind had grown stronger, but the herd was intact, and they had found a path that promised safety for the night. John dismounted, stretching his stiff legs, and looked at the woman. She nodded, as if acknowledging the small victory, but there was no celebration. This was survival, not triumph. And in that moment, John felt something he had not felt in years. Respect for the land, for nature, and for those who understood it better than he ever could on his own. That night, as he built a small windbreak with fallen branches and huddled near the herd, John thought about her words again. "We'll freeze if we don't stay close." It was more than advice about physical proximity in the cold. It was a lesson about trust, about guidance, about knowing when to let go of pride and follow someone wiser. He knew he would remember this night forever, the snow swirling around them, the cold biting at his face, and the quiet presence of a woman who had saved him, and the cattle from the merciless winter. The night on the plateau was long and merciless. Snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes, covering the rocks and the ground in a layer of white that seemed to grow with every passing hour. John Carter had never felt cold like this before. His fingers, even inside thick gloves, were stiff and numb, and his face burned from the biting wind. The herd of cattle huddled together nearby, their low moans of discomfort mixing with the whistle of the wind. He had done countless winter drives in his life, but this storm was different. It was relentless, sudden, and unforgiving. Every step he had taken earlier in the evening had been deliberate, careful, but now the land seemed to be testing him, trying to see how far he could endure. The Apache woman who had guided him moved with calm confidence. She had built a small windbreak from rocks and branches, and the cattle were pressed close behind it. John watched her work, marveling at her ability to remain steady in the middle of chaos. She spoke softly to the herd, using low, steady tones, guiding them and calming them in ways that John had never seen before. Her voice was almost like a song carried in the wind, strong enough for the animals to understand, yet gentle enough to soothe them. John realized that while he had spent decades learning about cattle, he had never seen someone work with them like this. There was a deep understanding, a connection that went beyond commands or force. John tried to help, arranging branches to block the wind, patting the animals to calm them, and shoving snow aside to make a small path. Every move required careful thought. One misstep, and he could fall, injuring himself or disturbing the cattle enough to send them scattering. He felt the cold biting deeper now, his boots filled with snow, his jacket stiff from ice forming on the sleeves. Despite the discomfort, he kept moving, knowing he could not stop. The woman had warned him to stay close. If they strayed even a few feet apart, the cold could take them. Her warning echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. Survival depended on unity, on staying together. Hours passed like this, the night stretching endlessly. John began to notice subtle things about the land, how snow gathered in certain dips, how rocks jutted out just enough to cause a slip, how wind gusts funneled through narrow paths. He realized that the woman's knowledge was far deeper than just instinct. She had spent a lifetime learning the secrets of these hills, the way the land shifted with the seasons, the hidden places where snow could pile dangerously or where warmth could be found. He had spent decades working here too, yet he knew now that his understanding was shallow compared to hers. Each time he made a small mistake, she guided him quietly, showing him the correct way without scolding or judgment. The first real challenge came when the wind shifted suddenly, forcing them to move to higher ground to avoid a snowdrift that was forming dangerously fast. The snow had begun to pile up, making the ground slippery and uneven. John led the herd slowly, trying to keep them close together, while the woman moved ahead, scouting the safest path. The air was thick with snow, visibility dropping to just a few feet, making the terrain even more difficult to judge. John's heart pounded in his chest as he guided the first few cows over a narrow ledge, knowing that a fall could be fatal. He reminded himself to breathe, to focus on each step, one at a time, and to trust her guidance. Suddenly, one cow slipped on a hidden patch of ice. It teetered dangerously close to the edge of a small ravine, its hooves scraping the frozen ground. John's heart jumped into his throat. He ran forward, grabbing the cow by the rope tied loosely around its neck, pulling with all his strength. The cow struggled, frightened, but he managed to steady it and guide it back onto safer ground. The woman watched quietly, her calm eyes never leaving the herd. She stepped forward only after the danger passed and nodded slightly at him, as if acknowledging both the risk and the lesson. John realized in that moment that survival here was as much about instinct as it was about patience. One wrong move could have destroyed everything he had worked to protect. As the night went on, John's exhaustion deepened. His body ached from hours of constant vigilance, from walking in snow that grew heavier and deeper. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, and he noticed the cold seeping into his bones. Yet, despite the fear and fatigue, there was a strange exhilaration too, a sense of purpose and focus he had never felt so intensely. Every movement, every decision mattered. He was no longer just a rancher moving cattle. He was a part of the landscape, attuned to the snow, the wind, and the land beneath his feet. He was learning to survive in a world that demanded respect, attention, and humility. Around midnight, the woman stopped and motioned for him to follow. She led him to a small hollow between two rock formations where the snow had not piled as deeply. Here, they could rest the cattle without the risk of them wandering into the deeper drifts. John helped her make a small enclosure with fallen branches and rocks, doing everything he could to shield the herd from the wind. The woman moved methodically, efficiently, without waste or hurry. John realized that efficiency in moments like this was survival, that every movement had to count, that there was no room for carelessness. Once the cattle were settled, the woman finally spoke to John. "You are learning," she said quietly, "but there is more than the snow to worry about. The land is alive. You must respect it, or it will teach you lessons you cannot forget." John listened, nodding slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He understood now that this was more than just a winter storm. It was a test, a reminder that humans were not masters of the land, no matter how much experience they thought they had. Survival depended on listening, on watching, and on trusting knowledge that might be older than anything he had ever learned in his lifetime. The night was far from over. Snow continued to fall, the wind howled like a living thing, and John felt the sharp sting of cold in his ears and hands. He kept the herd close, his eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. The cattle seemed to sense the danger too, staying tightly together, occasionally nudging each other for warmth. John realized that caring for them was not just about leading. They depended on him for guidance and protection, just as he depended on the woman for her knowledge and calm presence. This connection between human, animal, and land felt sacred, fragile, yet strong. He had never experienced anything like it before. Hours dragged on, and John felt himself drifting between alertness and exhaustion. Every step was a struggle, every decision critical. The snow-covered plateau seemed endless, but he could see that they were slowly moving toward lower ground. The woman occasionally paused, looking behind them, ensuring that the herd was safe, then moved forward again, always calm, always steady. John followed her lead, beginning to trust her instincts more than his own. He realized that pride had no place here. What mattered was survival, and survival required humility, patience, and respect for the forces around him. As dawn began to break, the snowlight transformed the world into a sparkling, white expanse. The wind had slowed slightly, giving them a brief respite, and John felt a small but profound sense of relief. They had survived the night, kept the herd together, and avoided the worst dangers of the storm. He looked at the woman, still calm, still steady, and realized how much he had learned in just a few hours. Her presence had been a lifeline, her knowledge a shield. Without her, the night could have ended very differently. He felt gratitude swelling in his chest, quiet but deep, a respect that words could not fully capture. By mid-morning, the plateau was transformed. Snow covered every rock, every plant, every trace of the path they had taken. The herd moved slowly, cautiously, as John and the woman guided them towards safer ground. The storm had left its mark, but it had also taught them something valuable, that preparation, guidance, and careful attention could overcome even the harshest challenges. John thought of the many storms he had faced before and realized that none had taught him the lessons this night had. He had learned to listen, to observe, and to trust, not just his own instincts but the wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime walking the land. By the time they reached a slightly more sheltered ridge, John knew the journey was far from over, but the first test had been survived. The herd was intact, and the snow, though still falling, was no longer as dangerous. He looked at the woman and smiled, a small gesture of gratitude. She returned it with a faint nod as if to say, "You are learning. There is more ahead, but you can survive." John felt hope, fragile but real, filling the cold space in his chest. He knew that the coming hours would bring more challenges, more tests of patience and skill, but he also knew that he was no longer alone. The woman's guidance had given him a lifeline, and he would follow it, step by careful step, until they reached safety. The storm showed no sign of relenting. By mid-morning, the snow had turned heavier, and the wind whipped across the plateau in sharp, cutting gusts. John Carter's boots were soaked, his legs stiff with cold, and his hands, though gloved, were beginning to lose feeling. The cattle moved cautiously, noses buried in the snow, their breath forming small clouds that faded into the gray sky. Each step was a struggle, each breath a reminder of the relentless cold. The plateau, which had seemed vast and open in daylight, now felt like a frozen maze, every ridge and dip hidden beneath layers of snow. John realized that this was the real test. The storm had entered its fiercest phase, and survival depended not just on skill, but on focus, patience, and trust. The Apache woman moved ahead with steady confidence, her steps precise, almost effortless. She scanned the terrain, her eyes taking in every shadow and contour, judging where the snow might hide dangerous slopes or thin ice. John watched her closely, following her movements and trying to learn. He had been proud of his own knowledge of the land, but in these conditions, he realized that experience alone was not enough. There were lessons he could only learn from someone who had spent a lifetime reading the land as if it were a story written in rock, snow, and wind. For hours, he matched her pace, guiding the cattle along narrow paths and around hidden crevices, keeping them close together as the storm's fury intensified. The first major danger came without warning. A hidden drift, larger than John had anticipated, gave way beneath the weight of a cow, sending it sliding dangerously toward a small ravine. The sound of hooves scraping ice made John's stomach tighten. Instinct took over. He sprinted toward the animal, grabbing the rope tied loosely around its neck and pulling with all his strength. The cow struggled, slipping again and again, but John managed to steady it, guiding it back to solid ground. His heart raced, pounding in his chest like a drumbeat. The woman watched silently, her expression calm, yet John could feel the unspoken weight of her presence, a reminder that one small mistake could have deadly consequences in this storm. Exhaustion was beginning to creep in. John's legs ached from hours of trudging through snow, his back stiff from leaning into the wind, and his fingers were barely functional despite his gloves. Yet the work had to continue. The cattle needed guidance, and he could not afford to falter. The woman's voice broke the wind occasionally, quiet but firm, guiding both him and the animals. "Keep moving, don't separate, watch the rocks." Each instruction was simple yet vital. John understood that in a place like this, even minor distractions could lead to disaster. He forced himself to focus, to let go of fear, and to trust in the methodical rhythm of survival. As the storm raged on, John noticed that his pride and independence were no longer helpful. He had always been someone who preferred to handle things on his own, relying on experience and instinct. But now he understood that alone he would not survive. The woman's presence was more than guidance, it was a lifeline. Her calm authority and knowledge of the land gave him direction when his mind was clouded by exhaustion and fear. Step by step, he learned to listen, to observe, and to trust. Even when the wind threatened to blow him off balance, or the snow hid treacherous dips, he felt a growing sense of humility. Survival was no longer about proving skill or courage. It was about learning, adapting, and respecting the power of nature. The breaking point came in the early afternoon. They had reached a narrow ridge, a section of the plateau where the snow had piled high on either side. The wind funneled through the gap like a blade, pushing against John with such force that he struggled to remain upright. One cow, spooked by the gust, veered too close to the edge. John lunged forward, gripping the rope and pulling with every ounce of his strength. But the ice beneath the animal's hooves cracked, sending a small slide of snow tumbling down the slope. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The cow teetered dangerously, the rope straining against John's hands, the wind screaming in his ears. He felt the adrenaline surge, a mix of fear and determination that left him shaking. He knew that one wrong move could cost him the animal, or worse, himself. The woman moved swiftly, appearing beside him in seconds, as if the storm itself could not slow her. With a firm but gentle grip, she steadied John, guiding him to shift his weight and leverage the rope more effectively. Together, they pulled the cow to safety, breathing heavily, faces streaked with snow and ice. John's hands were raw, his muscles trembling from effort, but a surge of relief washed over him. The storm had shown its power, and he had faced it head-on. More importantly, he had learned that teamwork, trust, and careful attention could overcome the harshest conditions. The woman's presence had turned what could have been disaster into survival, and he felt a profound respect for her wisdom. For the next few hours, John and the woman continued to navigate the treacherous landscape. The cattle stayed close, sensing the urgency and the authority in their guide's movements. Occasionally, one would stumble or struggle through deeper snow, and John would help, following the lessons he was learning from the woman. She never scolded or rushed him, only guided, corrected, and observed. Slowly, he began to anticipate the dangers she warned about, learning to read the snowdrifts, the wind patterns, and the hidden dangers beneath the white surface. Each success, each safe passage, built confidence, but John knew the storm was far from over. The plateau was relentless, and survival required constant vigilance. As evening approached, the storm's intensity began to waver slightly. The wind was still strong, but the snowlight softened, giving them a faint glow to navigate by. John's exhaustion was complete. His legs felt like lead, his back ached, and his fingers were stiff beyond comfort. Yet, there was a strange sense of satisfaction mixed with relief. They had faced the worst of the storm, kept the herd safe, and survived the plateau's hidden dangers. John realized that he had grown in ways he could not have anticipated. His understanding of survival, of trust, of connection with the land and the animals had deepened profoundly. This night, this storm, was a turning point, not just in the journey across the plateau, but in his life. The woman led them to a small canyon hollow, a natural shelter where snow had not piled as dangerously. Here, they could rest briefly, giving the cattle and themselves a chance to recover. John helped her arrange a makeshift windbreak with rocks and fallen branches. They huddled the cattle together, sharing body heat and protection from the gusts. The woman worked silently but efficiently, moving with a grace that seemed almost magical in its purposefulness. John watched and learned, understanding that survival in these conditions required more than strength. It required foresight, patience, and respect for the environment. Sitting beside the herd, John reflected on the lessons he had learned during the day. He thought about the moments of fear, the slips on ice, the hidden dangers, and the near disaster on the ridge. Each had been a test of his courage, judgment, and endurance, but more importantly, each had taught him humility. He realized that experience alone could not guarantee survival, only attention, careful planning, and guidance from those who truly knew the land could. The storm had stripped away pride, leaving only the essentials: focus, trust, and determination. John felt a quiet gratitude for the woman who had guided them, whose calm presence had turned a potentially deadly situation into a lesson in resilience. Night fell again, darker and colder than before. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying snow into every crevice. The herd huddled tightly, their warmth a small comfort against the chill. John kept watch, his eyes scanning the darkness, ears alert for any sign of danger. He felt the exhaustion in every muscle, but also a growing sense of inner strength. The breaking point of the storm had passed, but the lessons remained. He had faced the fear, endured the cold, and learned to trust in something greater than himself, the knowledge, wisdom, and calm presence of someone who had survived these lands for a lifetime. As he closed his eyes briefly, leaning against a rock for support, John made a quiet promise to himself. He would never forget this storm, these lessons, or the woman who had guided him through it. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew that he had gained something far more valuable than safety or survival: understanding. Understanding of the land, of the animals, and of the quiet, steady wisdom that comes from listening and observing. This night, this storm would stay with him forever, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life could endure with patience, respect, and trust. The morning came slowly, gray and cold, yet quieter than the night before. The storm had not completely ended, but the wind had softened, and the heavy snow had turned into a lighter flurry that dusted the plateau like powdered sugar. John Carter rose slowly, stretching his stiff muscles and rubbing the sleep and exhaustion from his eyes. The night had been long, and he could feel the weight of it in every joint and tendon. His fingers and toes still tingled from the cold, and the chill seemed to linger in his bones. But there was also a quiet relief. He had survived the storm's most dangerous hours, and the herd had remained intact. For the first time in many hours, he allowed himself to breathe a little more freely. The Apache woman was already moving among the cattle, checking their condition and guiding them gently to stand or shift for warmth. Her calm, deliberate movements reflected experience, and John watched her with admiration. It was remarkable how she remained so composed after the night they had endured. John realized that her knowledge went far beyond reading the land. It included an understanding of the animals themselves. She knew how to keep them calm, how to prevent panic, and how to conserve their energy for the long journey still ahead. John had learned to respect the land, but now he also learned to respect the creatures he was guiding across it. They set off slowly, moving toward a lower ridge that offered more shelter and less wind. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and each step was careful, measured. The plateau was still treacherous, hidden dips and icy patches threatening every move, but John's confidence had grown. He had survived the breaking point of the storm, and now he felt ready to take more responsibility for guiding the herd. The woman's instructions were still clear and steady. Watch the snow, watch the wind, watch each other. Her words were simple, but John found that repeating them in his mind helped him focus, helped him slow down and think before acting. He realized that patience could be as powerful as strength in situations like this. As the day progressed, John began to notice small signs of hope. The snow was lighter, and patches of grass appeared where the wind had blown it clear. The herd moved with less hesitation, following his voice and the gentle guidance of the woman. John felt a small thrill of accomplishment. He had learned to balance caution with action, and for the first time in hours, he felt in control, rather than being entirely at the mercy of the storm. He understood now that survival was not about fighting nature, but about working with it, reading its signs, respecting its power, and making careful decisions based on knowledge and observation. The first major challenge of the day came as they approached a narrow canyon path, partially hidden by snow. John stopped, studying the terrain, his eyes scanning for signs of danger. The woman stepped forward, inspecting the path with a practiced gaze. "We move slowly," she instructed, her voice calm but firm. John nodded, signaling the cattle to stay close and wait. Step by step, they began to navigate the path, John leading some of the cattle while the woman guided others. The snow was slippery, and rocks hidden beneath the surface threatened to trip both men and animals. Every step was a test of concentration, balance, and patience, but John felt the growing confidence that came from experience and careful observation. Halfway through the canyon path, John noticed a small rock ledge that seemed unstable. One misstep could send a cow tumbling down the slope. He paused, taking a deep breath, and gently guided the herd away from the ledge. The woman observed silently, then nodded approvingly, as if acknowledging his growing skill and judgment. John realized that he was beginning to understand her methods, not just her instructions, but her way of thinking about the land, the animals, and the storm itself. He felt a sense of pride mixed with humility. He was learning, but he was still far from mastering the knowledge she carried naturally. As they moved further, the weather began to improve. The wind was lighter, and the sun occasionally broke through the clouds, casting pale golden light on the snow-covered plateau. The warmth was small, but it lifted John's spirits. He felt renewed energy and determination to continue guiding the herd. He had survived the worst of the storm, and now it was time to focus on the journey ahead, making careful decisions to ensure that every step led toward safety. The herd responded to his energy, moving with a slightly quicker, more confident pace. John felt the connection between man and animal strengthen with each step. During a brief pause to rest the cattle, John observed the plateau around him. The snow, though still covering most of the ground, sparkled under the weak sunlight. Trees and rocks created shadows that shifted as the wind moved the clouds across the sky. The woman stood silently beside him, her gaze scanning the horizon, ever watchful. John realized how much he had learned simply by watching her. Her calm presence, her steady decisions, and her understanding of both the land and the animals were lessons he would never forget. He began to internalize her approach, slow, careful, respectful, observant. He realized that this way of moving through the world could apply to more than just survival. It was a lesson in life itself. As the day wore on, they encountered another test. A steep incline led toward a sheltered valley, but the path was partially covered in ice. One cow, frightened by the steepness and the slippery surface, began to back down, threatening to slide. John ran forward, positioning himself between the animal and the danger. He spoke in calm, steady tones, guiding the cow inch by inch. The woman moved alongside him, her hands steadying him as needed, offering quiet encouragement. Together, they helped the animal reach firmer ground. John's muscles ached. His hands were raw from gripping ropes and pushing against the cold, but he felt a surge of satisfaction. He had faced a critical moment and acted wisely, using both knowledge and patience rather than force or haste. By late afternoon, they finally reached the lower valley, where the snow was not as deep and patches of grass began to emerge through the white blanket. The wind had lessened further, and the threat of falling snow was minimal. John felt a profound sense of relief. They had survived the plateau's hidden dangers, guided the herd through treacherous paths, and endured hours of cold, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Yet he also recognized that the journey was not over. The plateau had taught him that challenges could come at any moment, and that survival required constant vigilance, patience, and respect for the land. The woman led them to a natural shelter among some large rocks and low hills, where they could spend the night with relative safety. She arranged a small area for the cattle to rest, using rocks and branches as windbreaks. John worked alongside her, following the careful methods she had taught him. Together, they made a space that provided both warmth and security for the herd. John felt a sense of accomplishment and understanding. He had learned to plan, anticipate danger, and act calmly under pressure. He had learned to observe the land, the animals, and the weather in a way that allowed him to make better decisions. And most importantly, he had learned the value of trust and teamwork. As evening fell, the plateau was quiet. The wind had mostly subsided, and the snow that continued to fall was light and soft. The cattle huddled together, safe and calm. John sat beside them, leaning against a rock, exhausted but alert. He watched the horizon, seeing the faint light of the sun as it disappeared behind the hills. He felt a quiet connection to the land, to the storm they had survived, and to the woman who had guided him through it. Her calm presence had been a lifeline, her wisdom a shield. John realized that he had grown, not just as a rancher but as a person. The storm had taught him patience, humility, and resilience. Before closing his eyes for the night, John thought again of the woman's words from the first night. "We'll freeze if we don't stay close." Now he understood them fully. The words were more than survival advice for the snow. They were a lesson in trust, connection, and awareness. The storm had forced him to let go of pride, to observe, and to act with care and patience. He had learned that survival, and even life itself, depended on these qualities. The journey was far from over, but John knew that he was no longer the same man who had begun it. He had faced the storm, learned its lessons, and begun to find hope, strategy, and confidence in a situation that had once seemed hopeless. As the night settled, the soft light of stars reflected on the snow, and the wind whispered through the valley. John felt a sense of quiet optimism. The storm had tested him, but it had also given him knowledge, skill, and perspective. He knew that the days ahead would bring more challenges, but he now had the tools and the understanding to face them. The Apache woman's guidance had been invaluable, and her calm strength had shown him that even in the harshest conditions, survival was possible when one moved carefully, thoughtfully, and with respect for the world around them. The following morning arrived calm and bright. Rare break in the storm that had tested John Carter and the herd for 2 long days. The snow that remained on the plateau sparkled under the pale sunlight, and the wind had softened to a gentle whisper that carried the faint scent of pine and earth. John stretched, wincing slightly at the stiffness in his muscles, and took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. For the first time in nearly 48 hours, he felt a small, profound sense of hope. The worst of the storm had passed, and the plateau, though still cold and snowy, no longer felt hostile. The herd, though weary, seemed to sense the change, moving together calmly, their breath misting in the cold air. The Apache woman was already on her feet, checking each cow with careful, deliberate attention. She moved among the herd with quiet authority, making sure that none were left behind or injured, her hands gentle but precise. John observed her, noting the efficiency and skill in every motion. She seemed almost part of the landscape, moving seamlessly with the wind and snow, aware of dangers that John might not even see. He realized that her presence had been more than guidance. It had been a lifeline, a combination of wisdom, intuition, and experience that no map or manual could provide. He felt gratitude, deep and unspoken, for her help and companionship in the harshest conditions he had ever faced. John gathered the herd and prepared for the next leg of their journey, leading them toward lower ground where the terrain was safer and the snow less deep. The sunlight reflecting off the plateau created a dazzling brightness, and John had to squint through the glare. The herd moved slowly but steadily, guided by his voice and the woman's gentle direction. Though the snow was still thick in some areas, the path was more manageable now. John's confidence had grown, not from recklessness, but from careful observation, trust in the woman's knowledge, and his own newly honed judgment. He had survived the storm and learned lessons that he knew would stay with him for life. Along the way, John reflected on how much he had changed over the past 2 days. He had come into this journey relying on his own experience, confident in his ability to handle the plateau and the cattle alone. But the storm had humbled him. It had shown him that survival was not just about strength or skill. It was about observation, patience, adaptability, and trust. He had learned to watch the land, understand the animals, and recognize the wisdom in the guidance of someone who had lived with these hills for decades. John realized that his pride and independence, though once strengths, could have been fatal if not tempered by respect and careful attention. By mid-morning, they reached a section of the plateau where the snow was shallower, and patches of grass began to emerge through the frozen ground. The wind had lessened further, and John could hear the faint sound of distant water flowing in the valley below. It was a small, comforting reminder that warmth and shelter were near. The herd moved with greater ease, the animals more confident as the danger of the plateau diminished. John felt a growing sense of relief and accomplishment. They had endured the storm, navigated treacherous terrain, and kept every cow safe. The plateau, which had once seemed insurmountable, had been conquered not by brute force, but by careful thought, observation, and teamwork. As they descended toward the valley, John noticed the subtle signs of life returning to the land. Snow melted along sunlit rocks, small streams trickled between icy patches, and birds, previously silent during the storm, began to call from the trees. The world seemed to awaken around them, a quiet reward for their perseverance. John felt a sense of connection to this land that went beyond survival. He understood that the plateau, with all its dangers and challenges, was also a place of beauty, resilience, and life. The storm had tested them, but it had also revealed the rhythm and patterns of nature that he had once taken for granted. The woman guided them toward a sheltered grove near a small stream, a place where the cattle could rest, graze, and recover from the storm. She arranged the herd carefully, ensuring that they were protected from any lingering wind and that each animal had access to grass or shallow water. John assisted her, following the methods she had taught him. Together, they created a small, safe haven in the midst of the plateau. John felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was the culmination of everything they had endured: the night-long vigilance, the treacherous ridges, the icy slopes, and the relentless wind. Every lesson, every careful decision had led to this moment of relative peace. As the herd settled, John finally allowed himself to sit and rest. His body was exhausted, sore from hours of walking in snow and guiding animals through dangerous terrain, but his mind felt clearer than it had in days. He thought about the challenges they had faced, the near disasters, and the moments when fear had threatened to overwhelm him. And he thought about the Apache woman, whose calm presence, patience, and knowledge had been a constant guide through every peril. John realized that her lessons extended far beyond survival. She had taught him humility, observation, trust, and the importance of moving with care and intention. These were lessons he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As evening approached, the valley took on a golden glow from the setting sun, and the air became still and quiet. John watched the herd, noting the way they rested together, warm from each other's bodies and the partial shelter of the grove. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for their safety and well-being. He had learned that every movement, every decision mattered. He had also learned that survival was not only about physical endurance. It was about care, attention, and respect for the land and the creatures who depended on him. John felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not only for enduring the storm, but for understanding the lessons it had taught him. That night, as the stars emerged above the valley and the last light faded behind the mountains, John sat quietly beside the herd. The plateau was calm, the wind reduced to a gentle whisper, and the snow glimmered under the starlight. He reflected on the storm, the dangers they had faced, and the lessons learned. He remembered the words of the Apache woman, "We'll freeze if we don't stay close." At first, he had thought of them only in the literal sense, staying near her and the herd to avoid freezing. But now he understood the deeper meaning. Staying close to knowledge, guidance, and connection was what truly allowed life to endure in the harshest conditions. In the following days, John and the woman led the herd down from the plateau to safer, more open grazing lands. The journey was calmer, but still required care. John had grown confident in his ability to navigate the terrain, to read the snow and ice, and to guide the cattle safely. Yet he never forgot the lessons of humility and observation. He walked closely beside the woman, absorbing every movement, every instruction, every glance she gave toward the land. He understood that the plateau had tested him not to break him, but to teach him the value of trust, patience, and respect for life in all its forms. By the time they reached the lower valleys, where the snow was light and the streams ran freely, John felt a sense of relief and accomplishment that was almost overwhelming. The cattle were healthy, the herd intact, and the plateau, though behind them, had left a lasting impression on him. He realized that survival was never just about physical strength or skill. It was about learning, observing, trusting, and adapting. The storm had been harsh, unforgiving, and exhausting, but it had also taught him lessons that no ordinary day could offer. He felt a quiet pride in his endurance, but more importantly, he felt gratitude for the wisdom and guidance that had carried them through. As he prepared the herd for the night in the valley, John took a moment to look back at the plateau, now distant but still visible under the soft snow. He thought about the storm, the fear, the moments of near disaster, and the calm guidance of the woman who had saved not only his life, but the lives of the animals he had cared for. He felt a deep connection to the land, to the animals, and to the lessons he had learned. The storm had been a test, a teacher, and a reminder that life's challenges were best faced with patience, observation, and respect. Before sleep, John made a quiet promise to himself. He would carry these lessons with him forever. He would never again underestimate the power of nature, the importance of humility, or the value of guidance and teamwork. The storm had shown him that survival was not about going alone or relying solely on one's own instincts, but about listening, observing, and respecting the wisdom of those who knew more than he did. It had shown him that even in the harshest conditions, life could endure when approached with care, patience, and understanding. As night settled over the valley, the herd rested peacefully, and the plateau lay silent in the distance. John felt a calm satisfaction he had never known before. The storm had tested him, humbled him, and taught him lessons that would last a lifetime. He knew that the journey through the plateau would remain with him forever, a story of survival, trust, and the quiet power of knowledge passed from one generation to another. And as he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that they had survived together, stronger, wiser, and forever changed.